If you're joining us for the first time, this is the Combined Funders 2016 Annual Report Training. Digging Deeper Section 201, the devil is in the details. All right, and just because we missed introductions, if you're just joining us for the first time this afternoon, my name is Cheryl Cohen, and I work for the City of Seattle Office of Housing, and I'm joined today by
Lana Caleb with the Washington State Housing Finance Commission.
And Justin Bombera with the City of Seattle Office of Housing.
So just to recap, I think most of you are familiar, but the funders using WBARS, the web-based annual reporting system, include the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, City of Seattle, King County, State Commerce, City of Tacoma, Snohomish County, City of Spokane, and City of Bellingham. So WBARS users, obviously the information you give to us is highly valued by us. And if we were in a room together, we would ask, what role do you play at your organizations? Which funders do you report to? And how many of you have home funds? Hopefully, those of you that have joined us today are those that are involved very closely in the annual reporting process. This is the Digging Deeper session, so we'll be going through how to review your reports for accuracy and a little bit more in the weeds than what we did in the morning. And always good to know which funders you report to, and hopefully if you have home funds, you joined us for the home mini session earlier today. To get the most out of today's training, hopefully you will have read the WBARS user guide, and it's available on the Finance Commission website, and that you've had working knowledge and experience with reporting in WBARS, and that you've printed the materials and are ready to follow along. So you should have received an email yesterday with the training materials for the Digging Deeper session, which include an annual report summary, Excel export issues, an Excel export sample, and the supplemental matrix. They are also now attached as handouts here in the webinar. So our core values for annual reporting in WBARS is consistency, accuracy, and reliability. It's really important that your annual reporting year to year is consistent. So we don't want to see, random changes happen where a move-in date was one date one year and then the move-in date changes the next year for the same family. So consistency in how you are reporting. Accuracy in making sure that you're providing information that's backed up by your records at your site level, so reporting incomes that match documentation in your tenant files. And reliability. So again, we rely on you to make sure that the information you're providing in your annual reports is as accurate as possible. And we're all kind of in this together, and we're here to help you do your best with your annual reports. So the agenda for the afternoon session, Digging Deeper 201, includes reviewing Table 1, 2, and 3. Most of this session will be on reviewing Table 1, and we'll go into considerable more detail than we did this morning. We'll also cover the matrix of additional supplemental annual reporting requirements and have opportunities for questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lana Caleb, and she's going to start diving into Table 1.
Okay, so I am going to switch over and go to our training site. Those of you that were here this morning, you saw the site before, and as I explained, this site is basically a duplicate of the live site. It's just that the information has been generalized, so we won't see property names and resident names. And I have this training bar up here at the top. So you wouldn't normally see that training bar on the live site. But as far as logging in, I am logging in on the site. Normally I would need an ID and a password, of course, to log into the live site. But on this site, I only need an ID. And I am logging in as a property manager for a large management company. And So this morning's session, we went through the particulars of what's on each page, how to navigate the pages. So I don't want to go over all that again, but I do want to mention, because this is a question we get a lot, how do you set up user IDs and passwords? So for those of you that are an organization administrator that may have not been in this morning's session, you need to access your organization, and I can do that by just clicking on the organization name. I can see who is already set up as a user, and if I look at my user list, those with a shield-looking item next to their names, they are your organization administrators who can do this process. If you are the organization administrator and you want to set up a new person, it's a two-step process. First, you have to give them an ID and a password. That will allow them to look at tables for your organization. If you actually want them to be able to edit, after you give them the ID and the password, you have to assign them in a role at each property where you want them to have edit rights. So if you wanted to set up a new person, you would click New, put in the ID, the password, the other information, and then down in this section, you need to set their applicable, the permissions that they will have. You can make somebody an organization administrator. You can make them an on-site manager, in which case you could only assign them in the on-site manager role for a property. And then anyone that you set up, you most likely, unless you want them to be able to view only, you most likely want to click this bottom one so that they have the ability to submit reports. Anybody that's going to be in as an owner or a property manager should not have this on-site manager box clicked because then they won't have full access. So if you click on the roles that you want them to have and go ahead and hit save. There's no way to delete a user in the system, so if you have an active user that you want to deactivate, you would access their record, you would click on this activate box and hit save, and that will deactivate them so that they will no longer have access to go in and do any editing on your tables. I'm going to cancel out of that. Gets me back to my organization. And for my organization, I can either hit the back button here, or I can go back to any of the pages that I've been at previously by clicking on that page. So I'm going to click on Projects, and that will take me back to my project list. You have a couple of different views here. You have My Projects or My Organization's Projects. My Projects will show you all the projects where you are listed as in one of the roles, either on-site manager, property manager, or the owner contact. If you instead choose My Organization's Projects, you will also see projects that are managed or owned by your organization, but that you are not assigned in an editing role. So I have 41 projects now, and when I go to My Organizations, I have 44. So sometimes we get calls and people say, well, I see some of my projects, but I can't see the one that I need to see. If you can't see it, it's because you're not assigned in one of the roles. But go ahead and click My Organizations and apply the selection. You can then go in, look at the property, and see who is assigned in the roles, and perhaps you need to ask your organization administrator to reassign you so that you have edit rights on that property. We talked about the import feature this morning. Those of you that are importing or wish to import, as soon as you hit this import button, you're going to get a little warning. The thing to remember with importing is once you do a Table 1 import, it totally wipes the existing Table 1 records for that reporting year. So if you wanted to try an import now and you've been putting in all of 2016's information, manually up to this point, I certainly would not recommend it. You would want to wait, finish up your 2016 report, and then at the beginning of 2017, you could play around with the import, and you could always go back and regenerate to January 1, 2017 from the prior year's table, but you wouldn't lose any information that you'd manually input for the next year. So if you do want to import, there's information for end users, which would be you, or information for software developers, and that includes the XML schema that your software developer would have to write to so that the information correctly pulled out of your software and was imported into WBARS in the correct areas. So I talked about that more this morning, so that's as much as I'm going to cover on importing here. I'm going to go back to projects. And I get back to my page with my project listing. I'm going to access a project, and keep in mind that if I go into a project, if it has the green H here with the circle, that means there are home funds on that property. If you're looking at a property and there's no H, that means there's no home funds, at least not for any of the funders that are in the WBARS system. So I'm going to click into this property. And we get into our project details page. And it's really nice if you're calling a funder with a question about WBARS, something specific on a page, that you can tell them what page you are on. And you can always tell that by looking up at the string, and the last thing listed, that is the page you are on. So this tells us right now we're on the project's details page. I can scroll through that page until I get to the annual summary report. And that's the first thing that we're going to take a look at for the reporting process. I'm going to click on 2016. And when I do that, it's going to pull up this annual summary report. This is one of the documents that was attached, so that if you have it printed out and you want to take notes on it, you would have that available for you. This report is excellent if you are using WBARS as your compliance software. So if you are manually inputting residents as they move in, move out, recertify, you can come in here and pull this report up at any time, and the information will be current as of the last time that you updated Table 1. So it tells you the funders involved on your property, and so at this property, Commerce stands for the State Department of Commerce, KC stands for King County, SOH stands for Seattle Office of Housing, and WSHFC stands for the Housing Finance Commission. So you can see the funders involved, and you can see all of their set-aside requirements. The set-aside requirements always start with the lowest AMI and then move to the higher AMIs. The reason this is because you always need to do compliance to your most restrictive, making sure that you meet all of your lower set-asides first, and then only if there are actually units still available can you actually utilize those higher set-asides. So at this property, there are 26 units, and I can see that all funders tell me there's 26 units in the project. On the total low-income set-aside units, though, you'll notice there's only 25 units for each funder. That means each funder is restricting 25 of the 26 units, leaving one unit to be unrestricted, a market unit perhaps. If you have tax credits, perhaps it's a common area unit, and it'll be up to you to know what each one of those funders is expecting you to do with that extra unit. I will tell you with this one, for the Housing Finance Commission, that extra unit is a common area unit for a staff individual. For the other funders, it's either called a staff unit or an unrestricted unit. The column out here to the right is the one that I was saying is your numbers as of the last time that you updated Table 1. So when we look at this property with their 4 funders, we can get a snapshot of where they're at. Starting with the 30% units, we can see that Commerce doesn't need any at 30, King County's looking for 13, Seattle's looking for 15, and the Commission is looking for 13. What I suggest you do if you have a property like this with multiple funders is draw yourself in another column that says most restrictive or target units so that you can figure out what you actually need at this property. When you look at the 30%, you have to look at who needs the most, and that is the City of Seattle, and they are looking for 15. Therefore, in order to be in compliance with all funders, this property would need 15 units at 30%. Currently, they only have 12, so we've got a 3-unit shortage there. Then we would go to the 40%. This gets a little trickier on this one to figure out exactly how many units you need at 40%. King County and the Commission are looking for 7. However, they only needed 13 at 30%. So if in fact this property had 15 units at 30%, they wouldn't need 7 units at 40, they would only need 5. That is because the 2 extra units that qualify at 30 certainly qualify at 40 as well. Kind of the easier way to look at this sometimes is to say, okay, this is how many they need at 30, and then draw a line under the 40 and say, okay, as of 40, I need to have 20 units, adding the 30s and the 40s together, at or below 40%. If you already have 15 here, an additional 5 at 40 would meet that requirement. Then we move on to the 50% units. And again, we have to look at the same thing. What does everybody require? Department of Commerce is looking for all their units to be at 50 or below. King County isn't looking for any at 50. Seattle's looking for 10, and the Commission isn't looking for any. So how many do we need? If we had 15 and 5, so a total of 20 at the 40% or below level, that would tell us we need another 5 units at 50%. And then if we had that, we would meet all of these requirements. So as you can see, it's not as straightforward as just looking at what any one funder wants. You have to combine what everybody's requirements are to get your most restrictive. Now, if you've been following, we've got 15, 5, and 5 for a total of 25 units. There's 25 restricted. So even though King County and the Commission allow for 5 units at 60, if you had these units at 60%, you would not be meeting the requirements of the City of Seattle and the Department of Commerce, because all of their units need to be 50 or below. So looking at what the property actually has, you can see that they're short in areas, but they do have 1 unit listed as 60. And so that's something that you'd need to look at closely on the Table 1 to see if that unit was really allowed. If we look up to these numbers, they had 26 units in the project. Everybody's only restricting 25, so it is possible that we could have 1 unit here at 60%. If it were the unrestricted staff or common area unit and instead was rented to a qualified household, then it could be rented at 60%. So hopefully you followed through that example, and we'll continue looking. If they have the restricted units, then we have common area units. None of the funders are ever going to say a unit's required to be a common area unit. So for the commission, there is a common area unit, but it's not listed as a requirement because, again, if the unit's not needed for a common area, it could be rented to a lower AMI. And at this point, it doesn't look like they have a common area unit that they're utilizing. The next line down, line 4, total market rate units. Again, no funders are going to say there's a market rate unit required. It does look like they're utilizing a market rate unit, and so we're definitely going to want to look and see which unit is marked as a market, and is that correct, and is it allowed. Next line down, line 5, total units vacant or empty. This property has 5 vacant units, and you just want to double check those. So they were short on their 30% units and their 40s and their 50s, but they do have some vacant units that they could use to cover some of those slots. So they might be okay at this point. The next section we want to look at, I'm going to roll the page up just a little bit so it's easier to see, are the tax credit special needs units. And if we expand, if we can click on any of these plus signs and expand an area, I'm going to click on large household to expand that, because as an auditor, that's one of the first things I do when I look at the annual report summary, is do a double check once I've seen that the commitments were met, is do a double check of the large household and just make sure that all the units that were slated or designated as a large household actually meet the definition. So those of you that have tax credits, this applies to. And if you have a tax credit set aside for a large household, by definition, that is a 3-bedroom or larger unit with 4 or more people. From looking at this report, you can't tell how many occupants are in the unit, but you can tell at a quick look that there's a 2-bedroom unit that is being used to meet one of these set-asides. So although the property is required to have 5, and this report shows they have 5, in actuality, they only have 4 units to meet this set-aside. And so that's something we'll need to look for on the Excel export. Disabled, it looks like they've met the set-aside. And homeless, it looks like they're 2 units short. But again, there are some vacant units, and perhaps those are being held for homeless individuals. And you would want to double check that. Section 7 has to do with the home program, which Cheryl covered in the home mini session. But if, just in case there's someone who has home and didn't attend that session, just want to point out that if you expand in this home section here, you can see that your funders may have designated not just how many home units you need, but what size units they need to be in. And so this will give you a breakdown. And right now, this property, they're reporting homes units to the city, but they aren't reporting any to the county. So it looks like they've got their designations off on their home units, and that's something that Cheryl went through in the home mini session. If I continue down the page, everything before this break here had to do with information coming directly from Table 1. Information below this break for questions 8 and 9, that is from inputs on Table 3. That is why right now it doesn't show that there are any current households that meet these set-asides. Not unusual. Usually you do Table 1, get it completely ready to go, then you go and do Tables 2 and 3, and so we would expect that during the year these show as 0. Of course, by the time you submit all of your tables, we're going to expect that you've met your set-asides, and these numbers will be filled in based on your Table 3 inputs. The last one, number 10, that's just says whether or not for each one of your funders it's an elderly property, an elderly set aside. If your property has multiple sites, that first summary is project-wide, and then below that it would split the information into sites. So this property only has one site, so the information for the site split really is not going to do you any good. The information for the project is more comprehensive. If you do have a project with multiple sites and the set-asides are specific for each site, then you would want to come down here and you would want to check your compliance for each individual site at the property. And typically you would have separate sites if you were a scattered site project, or if you had a property where one of your funders funded maybe the whole property and another funder only funded a portion of the property. And so we would split it up so that everybody could check their compliance based on the units that were in the subset or in the site as they were divided up. So that is the annual summary report. And I would really like to encourage those of you that are using the WBARS system to do your compliance for you, that you go in and you check this every time you update your table 1 to make sure where you are with your compliance. So I am going to navigate back. So I'm going to go back to my project details. And I'm going to continue down that page, and I'm going to click into my site. I only have one site for this property. And I'm just navigating through to show you some things along the way and to get to our actual tables for submission. When I talked about if you set up a person, it's a 2-step process. You give them an ID and a password, but then you also have to assign them in a role at the property. This is where you do that. If you're an organization administrator, you have an edit button here, and when you click that edit button, it then opens up fields. And sorry, my training site is on a different server, so it's a little slower than the actual site. But it actually opens up these fields for to changing the organization or changing the user within the organization that's assigned in the role. At this property, there's a property manager. There's nobody at the on-site level. Somebody could be added, but in order for them to be in this drop-down, they would have to be, when they initially were set up, the on-site box would have to be checked for them. And as you can see at this, well, actually, I would have to type in the organization's name first. And let's just click this one. Normally, you'd start typing the name of the property, and it would just populate here. But because the information's been generalized, that didn't happen for this one, because they're all called organization with some number after it. And boy, it didn't want to do that for me. Okay. Might be due to my test environment. Oh, look, now it filled it in. So if that's my organization, I could click on the drop-down. There's no choices for an on-site manager, and what that says to me is when individuals were set up, nobody had that on-site manager box clicked. Only those people that were clicked as on-site managers when they were initially set up would be available in this drop-down box. So I am going to hit cancel at this point because I do not want to assign anybody in the on-site manager role, because if I did, I'm in as property manager, I would lose my edit rights. The tables always start at on-site, then are submitted to the property manager level. If there's no on-site, the table starts at the property manager level to begin with. And I can see that if I keep scrolling down, reports by year, all tables for 2016 are currently at the property manager level, and so I would have edit rights to them. Tax parcel ID number, you can't change this. If you note it's wrong, please let your funder know and we can correct it. Then we get to buildings, and if you click in this area, you can see the building information for each of the buildings at the property. That includes the building setup, the units, square footage, number of bedrooms, and it's also the place where you set up your utility allowances. We talked about utility allowances this morning, so I'm just going to touch on them here. Hopefully, if you are the person reviewing your reports, you already know how to set up utility allowances, or we're in this morning's session. Sounds like we have a question on this, and?
The question is, as a property manager, do we not have edit rights if it is at the on-site level?
That's correct. In order to be able to edit, you have to be in one of the roles, on-site or property manager, and the table has to be at your level. Once it's passed from property manager up to owner, an owner can always view. An owner can never edit one of the tables. They can only submit forward to the funder, which locks the table in for the year, or they can unsubmit back to the property manager level and ask them to make corrections. But yes, you have to be in the role and the table has to be at your level. Okay, I'm going to move down. To set up a utility allowance, you either have to be in the property manager role or you have to be an organization administrator for either the property management company or the ownership entity. So if somebody's in as an on-site manager, they are not going to be able to set up the utility allowances. To set up an allowance, if you need to add additionals, you would add rows and then fill in the information. You want to make sure for allowance source that you are being consistent in the source that you're using from one year to another, because anytime you change the allowance source in the setup, you also have to change it on every resident record in order for it to come in here and be able to match up and pull the right utility allowance. You will notice that past allowances are grayed out. We experienced some issues with people typing over the prior allowances. So once a report is submitted, so when the 2015 report was submitted, this 2015 allowance got locked in. If you need to, if it was incorrect, say it wasn't supposed to be 65, it was supposed to be 66, and that's the allowance that's for 2016 as well, you would go in, add rows, put in as of 1/1/2016, put in the corrected allowance, and that would allow you basically to fix it for the 2016 report. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment because I haven't gone through fully utility allowances and see if any questions are coming in on how you set these up. While I'm taking that pause for questions, I will just mention that when you set up utility allowances, you have to set them up for each building at the property. So if you have a property with duplexes, you might have 50 buildings you have to go in and you have to update the utility allowances on. The comment section is always great to use if you have kind of strange situations where some utilities are for some units. For example, I have a building in Seattle and most of it is all electric, but there's some units that have gas on one end of the building, so they have a slightly different utility allowance, and so they add that comment in here because for some they use the S8 too, and for others it just says Section 8, and then they tell me why are they using two different sources. It's because one's all electric and one has electric plus gas. So the comment section is very helpful. So Justin, did anybody come up with questions?
Yeah, so for new projects, does it work for this hang on, does it work the same for the project's first reporting? Do you just click on add rows to input them?
Yes, so in case you didn't hear the question, it was for a new property to initially set up your utility allowances. Do you do it the same way by clicking the add rows? And yes, you do. When you click add rows, it'll automatically add 3 blank rows. If you only need one of them, you just fill in the ones you need, and then we're going to come up here, hit save. Remember, if you don't hit save on a page, all the work you did will be lost. You always have to hit save on a web-based system before you navigate away from the page. So if 3 popped up, you only used 1, you hit save, the extra 2 will just go away. If you need more than 3, fill in the 3, hit save, then hit add rows again, and you'll get 3 more. Okay. Any other questions pop up on that?
That's it so far.
Okay, then we're going to move on. So I'm going to go into the 2016 reports just by clicking on the 2016 and the reports by year. And then we get to the report cover page. And on the report cover page, typically when you come in, this is the default. Unless you've recently been in the system on the property and you were in Table 1, it might bring you to Table 1 instead. But you can easily navigate between the tables by just clicking on what look like these little file folder tabs to get between one tab and another. Most of this is just a summary, but there are a couple of areas I want to point out on here. Ownership certification, this is new this year. So when an owner is put into the system, the owner contact, that should be the authorized signer. And the City of Seattle has made this ownership certification active on their properties, and I believe Department of Commerce and other funders will, before the 2016 reports get submitted. And what this is it's just saying that the person who's listed as the contact for the owner is authorized to submit the reports, and they will have to check off here before they can actually submit the tables, or they will there'll be a hard stop and the system will not submit the tables. So definitely that's a new area to look at this year. It's very similar to the home suitability for occupancy certification, which also requires, if the property has home units, for the owner to certify regarding the suitability of occupancy for those units. And it's also a hard stop. If it's not done, it will not allow you to submit the tables. And so those are kind of the areas here. Oh, and then there's also this project update. And this is the area where if you have something that you want to convey to all of your funders, this is where you can put that note. At the Commission, we still require a hard copy with a wet signature of a report to come in. And a lot of you give us a cover sheet and maybe explain something like there was a fire and it affected 3 units. Well, great, that means we know it, but if you have other funders on the property and you're not sending them that cover sheet, then they wouldn't know about that instance. So if you want all of us to know, you simply type in your project update here and we can all see it. And from there, I'm going to navigate to Table 1. And really what we're going to look at is the Excel export of that Table 1. And a reminder that when you're looking for the annual reporting process, you want to make sure you select this unit information year-to-date version of Table 1. That will give you the residents that lived in the unit all year long, even if they've moved out and somebody new has moved into the unit. For example, Unit 104, here's the prior resident, and then we have the current resident. If you just look at latest unit information, this click, which is the default, you wouldn't see this prior resident listed. And if you'd failed to put information in for them, you wouldn't know that you had missed it, at least not from this view. The all Table 1 records is not something that's on the live site. That is specific to this training site. So at this point, I would go ahead, I've got unit information year to date, I would process my Excel export. Just to make this a little bit easier, because the Excel export has a lot of information, and it's very distracting to try to look at it on the screen in a webinar situation such as this. So what I did in one of the attachments, you will find an Excel export, and it is 2 legal size pieces of paper, and I just just have a copy already generated in Excel. And so this is what it should look like with the green bar across the top. So that we can see more on my screen without making the writing impossibly small to read, I am just going to hide a couple of rows. So this first row only has the building name, and on this generalized site, you know, building 1, building 2 doesn't tell us much. So I'm going to hide that. And then let's look at the columns that we have here. The unit, the household name, again, it's been generalized, move-in date, previous cert date, current cert date, move-out date, if there was one, is the unit vacant, tax credit special needs, what is the AMI, what is the household size, what is the maximum annual household income, what's the current household income, what's the square footage. For what we're looking at today, square footage is not going to come too much into play, so I'm just going to hide that column to make more room. Then we have number of bedrooms, maximum allowed rent, what's the utility allowance, what's the resident payment, those two things added together for the total rent with utility allowance, what's the unit designation, what's the utility allowance source, and then it keeps going. I just want to quickly look down at this utility allowance source, and if I look down my page, I can see that that is the same for all of the households. A couple are blank, but those are vacant or empty units. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hide this column as well, again, just to make it easier so you can see more on my screen. Then I have validation status and validation issue. Keeping in mind that the system is not set up to look for every error that could be there, it is set to look for certain validations. So this will give you a hint that there may be an issue. And I'm going to slide my page, keep sliding it over here, because the second half of the report, which if you got it printed out on legal size paper, is going to print on the right-hand side, or the second sheet of paper. I did, when I printed it, I did relist the unit number, so you should be able to follow across. We have more historical information and then home information on this half of the report. So we've got move-in restricted AMI, move-in household size, move-in maximum allowable rent and gross rent. Is it a home unit? Maximum allowed home rent, home category, home unit occupancy, were they a tenant before home? So all those columns are specific to the home units. Is there a subsidy type? And if so, what is the subsidy amount? And then what is the total rent with utility allowance and subsidy? Current monthly gross income, current AMI, that's the actual AMI. So you may have a household slated at 30%, but if you actually look at their income, it tells you where they actually fall. So this household is below that 30, their actual income puts them at 21%. Then we have a couple more home columns. So home ethnicity, home race, home type of household, and the comments field. And then if you put a transfer into the system using the transfer key, as you should, this is the automatic notation of that transfer. And those are all of the columns. So as you can see, it's a little hard for me to show you all of the columns at once. well, it's impossible for you to be able to still see it if I did that. So I'm going to have to do some scrolling around on my screen. I will say that for the first areas that we're going to look at, everything is going to be on the screen portion that you can see right now, which is on the first page of the printout with the green bar all the way across the top of the piece of paper. So what we're going to go through in this exercise is we're going to go through and we're going to look for where there are potential errors, and then we're going to talk about how to fix them. To make it easy for you as far as notes go, there was an attachment, and hopefully you printed it out, and it's called Excel Export Issues, and it looks like this. It is a 4-page document, Word document, and the way it goes is it talks about the unit, okay, and what's potentially wrong with it, or what you see, why that might be showing the way it is, and then how to fix it. So hopefully you have that printed, and that'll help you follow along to see what the errors are and how to fix them. So I'm going to navigate back to the Excel export so we can start taking a look. And we're just going to start with the first unit. And I just need to slide my page up so I'm at the first unit. And that is Unit 101. In looking at that unit, keep in mind that if items are in bold, it has a potential meaning. If items are highlighted, that's telling us to take a second look. And if there's a validation, we definitely want to look. Of course, there are other issues that might not show up in any of those ways that we would also want to take a look at. So in this first unit, Unit 101 here, as we look across, we see that there is a highlight in the vacant column. Why is it there? This unit had an occupant in it. They moved out in June, and the unit is still vacant as of this time. The highlight is there because the unit was vacant for longer than 90 days. So how do you fix that? Well, if someone moved into the household, obviously you want to process the move-in and get the new residence information showing. Please keep in mind that when I say process, I mean you need to go back to WBARS and you need to process the move-in. Simply inserting a line and showing that new residence information in Excel will not feed back into WBARS. It will only show on the Excel version that you're looking at, and that's not what you're going to send to your funders. Your funders are going to look at what's in WBARS and generate their own Excel export. So please make sure when you see an error, you go back and fix it in WBARS. So a new move-in might be the fix to this one, but let's say nobody did move in, and the unit was just vacant from June and through the end of the year. I would say you would definitely, for a tax credit property, want to do the extended vacancy rent ready report. You can also share that report with your other funders so they see the same explanation, because they're also going to be wondering why the unit was vacant for such a long period. You can certainly add a comment in WBARS as well on the resident screen, and of course that comment would show up way over here to the right. And the fact that this column is so narrow tells me that no comments have been entered at all on this table. So I'm going to go back so we can see the main part of this residence information. So either process the move-in or explain why it's vacant so long would be the thing to do with Unit 101. I'm going to move down to the next unit, Unit 102. On Unit 102, you can see there's highlighting on the certification dates, and there's also a validation that tells us a certification will be needed sometime during this calendar year. So obviously, there's a 2014 and a 2015 cert here, but there's no 2016. So how do you fix it? If the household recertified in 2016, go into WBARS and process the 2016 certification. that'll make a 2016 date in the current cert, and if you process the recertification correctly, it'll show a 2015 cert in the previous date. If the household failed to recertify, you're definitely going to want to need to add a comment and tell us why the household did not recertify during the year. And if it's a tax credit property and you didn't get a recertification during the year, we are most likely looking at non-compliance. So you should be prepared to not only provide that comment, but to show us what you have done to try to correct the non-compliance in this area. Next up, I'm going to look at Unit 103. And with 103, notice there's no validations. There's no highlighting on this resident, but there is something that we would want to pay particular attention to. And that is the fact that we're only showing one resident in this unit, and if we look to their move-in date, they moved in October of 2016. So the question then is, what was going on with the unit from January until October 16th? Is it that there was another resident there that's not showing on the report? If that was the case, I would go back and double check that when I generated my Excel export that I had checked all units, or not just the current status, the latest, but to see all of the resident records. If I had, perhaps when this resident was moved in, instead of using the move-in process, what sometimes happens is a existing resident record gets pulled up and gets typed over. When that happens, the prior resident disappears from the reporting. If that's the issue, I have some directions on the how to fix that will kind of give you a workaround and enable you to go back, put the prior resident in without having to delete the current resident's information and starting over. The other issue that may happen here is that the unit just was vacant for that first part of the year, and if that's the issue, then you're going to want to make sure you do that extended vacancy rent ready report if you have tax credits. If you don't have tax credits, definitely that you add a comment on this line explaining the vacancy for the first part of the year. Justin, do we have any questions coming in so far?
Yeah, there was just one question about how to upload the report. If you could just kind of give a little overview of uploading Table 1.
How to upload.
Let me get back.
You cannot upload, you can't take information from Excel and import it into WBARS. It's kind of a one-way street that way. You can take your WBARS information and export it to Excel, but to import into WBARS, you would have to have a third-party software company and have them do an import process for you so that you could go in and hit import and the information would feed in. So that's what I was meaning by don't go in here and make corrections on the Excel export and assume that they're going to be made in WBARS. Okay, so I'm going to move to Unit 201, and if I look at this unit, we will see that there's a highlight on the certification date. And why is that? Well, because it's a 2015 date and it's looking for 2016. But if you note on this one, there's no validation here. The reason being is technically when we're doing this today and we're in November, this recert is not due yet. So it's highlighted because it's looking for a 2016, but it's not doing a validation because technically it's not due yet. But let's say this resident is transferring, and this resident's going to transfer down to Unit 202, right below it, which is vacant. If this resident were going to transfer, depending on when they were transferring, You might want to go in and process the recert first so it shows for Unit 201, and then when you transfer them to Unit 202, it will copy to the new unit. Now, if they transfer before this date, it is acceptable as well to first transfer them and then process the recert. Either way would work on this one. But I wanted to mention this because I wanted to remind everybody that if you are processing a transfer, you need to use the transfer function in WBARS. Do not process as a move out and a move in. If you do this and the household that you transferred is over income, it's going to look to all your funders like you moved in an over income household. And adding comments in WBARS is not the goal that we're looking for here. We want you to process the transfer so it shows up in the transfer message. The other reason you want to process it as a transfer is if you have other funders beyond the commission, you're going to have to do tables 2. And for table 2, if you process a move-in and a move-out, it counts the household twice. If you process it as a transfer, it only counts the household once, which is what those funders want. They only want the household to be counted once, not twice. So that was our issue on 201. I don't have anything for 202. For 203, this is another one where when we look at this unit, there is no highlight, there is no bold, but there is something that's a little strange on this unit. And by strange, I mean that it has a unit designation of market. When we looked at the annual summary report, I noted that there was one unit that was market, and we'd really want to see if that was allowed at this property. And market units are not allowed at this property. The one unit that's not restricted is actually for a common area. And if you don't use a common area for staff, it cannot be turned into a market unit. It must become a restricted unit. But I do notice that this resident has moved in 2012, has been doing certifications, clearly qualifies as a homeless 40% household. What you will find is if it's designated as market, which was probably a slip of the finger at the time of inputting, even though it shows as homeless and 40%, it will not count as homeless or as 40% on the annual summary report because market units do not meet those requirements. So the first time somebody called me with one of these and said, when I count up my homeless units on table 1, it does not add up to the annual summary report. The annual summary report is wrong. Fix it. What we figured out is if it's designated as market, even though it shows, it's not going to count. So the fix here is to go back in to WBARS and redesignate this household as restricted. And as soon as you do that, it will then count as homeless and then count as 40%. And since we were missing 40% units on our annual summary report, or we were short, this will help us out there. And if you're following along on those errors, it is time to flip the page, or go to the next page, I should say. And we're going to Unit 104. And I'm going to slide my page up. Unit 104, we had a prior resident. It is doing some highlighting on the certification dates because it's looking for a 2016. However, they moved out before their recert was due, so I would just ignore that highlight. Well, maybe I shouldn't say ignore. I would look at that highlight and I would say, okay, that's perfectly fine, and then I would move to the next one. And by the next one, I mean the new resident in Unit 104. If we look at this household, we'll see that they moved in 2016. Their income is bold, so that means they're over income for 30%. Their total rent with utility allowance is highlighted, which means it exceeds the limit. So the maximum allowed rent is $609, But with utility allowance and rent, this resident is paying $810. And if we go to the validations, it's telling us both of those items. Now, when I first see this, I would scroll over and I would look to see if there was a transfer. Maybe they moved in over income because they were a transfer. Not appear to be the case. So looking back, I would then say, well, what else could be happening with this resident? And keeping in mind they're over income and they're paying too much rent, the first thing I would look to is, was the 30% designation correct? Chances are this household really should have been designated as a 40 or a 50% unit. If they did not meet the income qualifications that move in, they can't be a 30%. And if they were charged too much rent, that would be a non-compliance issue unless, in actuality, they were redesignated to a 40 or a 50. So, Justin, we have a question?
Yeah, we got 2 questions.
Okay.
So, first one, do we recertify our management units?
We have a sample coming up where I'm going to show you a manager unit, and we're going to get into that. So let's table that for just a moment.
What about when we complete a transfer in an outside software and import the information? How should you mark the transfer?
If you're outside software, so Yardi, Boston Post, AMSI, sorry, they all have a transfer function as well. And if your transfer is put into that system and then uploaded, that transfer message should come across. The problem with transfers in other systems, WBARS only allows a resident to be in one unit on a specific day. So a lot of those software systems allow you to move somebody out of one unit and into the new unit on the same day. If you do that, that transfer will not upload correctly. And in most cases, that means the residents move into the new unit will not show up. And so you'll need to watch for that closely. You will get an error message when you do that upload telling you something went wrong. So hopefully you can work with your software developer, or you can just know that when you put someone in as a transfer in your software, that you make them move out of the unit, old unit on one day, move into the new unit on the next day. If all of that fails and you import and it blows up on you, then at that point, then you may need to do some manual manipulation, and that may be going into their old unit and processing the transfer manually, or it may mean going in and adding comments on units that didn't show up as a transfer. But we do not want that to be the norm, that on all your transfers, they show in as a move-in or move-out and a move-in with a comment. If you have further issues with that, I suggest that you contact one of your funders, and we may even need to put you in contact with our software company, and they can perhaps help you work that out. Were there any others, Justin?
We are good.
Okay. So most likely fix on this is to change this AMI from a 30 up to a 40 or a 50. And I'm going to move down to unit 105, 106. I didn't see any issues with those. 107. 107 is another one, no validations, no highlights. And this is a little bit tricky one. If you do not have tax credits, this is not going to make any sense to you, okay? But if you have tax credits and you have a large household set aside, this is the unit that when I looked at the annual summary report and I said a 2-bedroom had been used to meet a large household set aside and it doesn't meet the definition, this is that unit. It's a 2-bedroom, but it's been designated as a homeless and large. The fix here is to go in and on the tax credit special needs set-asides to make it just a homeless and not a large as well. Of course, now you've lost a large household and you need to find a replacement. Okay, and I'm going to Unit 204. When I look at 204, I've got a couple things going on. I've got a highlighting and a bold, and I also have some missing information that is not as apparent. So let's start with the highlight and the bold. We've got a highlight and a bold on the current annual gross income. Tells us they're over income because it's in bold, and because it's highlighted, it tells us they're over by 140% or more. We can also see that in the validation. Okay. I will say that the bolding and the highlighting, I've pretty much found that to be 100% accurate. I have found sometimes that validations don't show up. The validation message will not show up. So in other words, this may still have said green and there may have been no message. So I strongly encourage you, when you're reviewing, pay really good attention to the bolds and the highlights. Definitely look at the validations, but just because there's no validation message does not mean there is not an issue. So this household, over 140. So then we're going to go and we're going to say, well, when did they move in for the tax credit world? Because if they went over 140 at their first recert, it's going to require some additional work. This household's lived here since 2013. So the fact that they're now over 140 is not going to be a tax credit issue. But when I'm looking at those cert dates, I do notice that the prior cert date is missing. So to fix this, that would be going back into WBARS, looking at the 2015 certification date and making sure that that's filled in. And for Unit 205, nothing to fix there. I'm going to scroll the page up so it's easier to see. 206, 207, and then I go to 108. Nothing, I didn't see anything in those units until I'm going to go to Unit 109. Unit 109, this gets to the question that somebody brought up about the manager's unit. So this unit, I had to finagle a little bit so it didn't just say resident with a number. This is a resident manager in this unit. Sometimes reports say resident manager. Sometimes we find that you put the actual resident manager's name here. Sometimes we see staff unit. Any of those are okay. So this is the resident manager, and you notice that it looks like this person has been certifying, but there's no 2016 recert done yet. But it looks like they've been certifying, and oh, this is the unit that was showing as 60%. And it looks like the household qualified at 60%. But the unit is showing as restricted. So we have a couple of choices here. The household, or the unit can either be changed to show as a common area unit, in which case the resident manager would not need to income qualify and would not need to do certifications, as long as it was allowed that you had a common area unit. And so if we made this a common area unit, we'd want to take out the 60%, and then it would show as a common area and not as a 60. However, if you wanted to keep qualifying this household as a 60% restricted unit rather than a common area, then you would need to process a 2016 recertification for this household, just like you would for any other qualified household. So the person that had the question earlier about do you need to recertify your manager, please type in and let us know if that did not answer your question, and we can talk about it further. And Justin will let me know if that question comes in, and we'll definitely go back to that if that happens. But in the meantime, I'm going to move forward. Unit 110, I didn't see any issues. Unit 111. Cheryl covered this unit in the home mini session. And at this point, we're kind of going to get to some of the information more on the second page of the Excel document. So I'm just going to scroll over on this one. You're not going to see any highlights. You're not going to see any validations. But if we keep going, we'll see that, yes, it's a home unit. It's for the city. Oh, but this is a home column and there's nothing there. And this is a home column and there's missing information. So in this instance, you would need to go back into the resident record and you would need to fill in these home fields that are currently empty. So again, no validations, no highlights on that. It's just something that you have to double check for. And I know, I'm sure when Cheryl talked to you about the home mini session, you can certainly, in Excel, go over and sort all of your home units to sort together. If you sorted by your home columns, and then it would be a lot easier to see if you were missing information in these columns rather than, you know, trying to totally scroll across the report. So that's Unit 111. And I'm going to go to Unit 112. Justin, nothing else on that common area?
Yeah.
Nope. Okay. We'll assume we answered the question. 112. This is another one. No validations, no highlights, but definitely something going on here. So if we look at this resident, we're going to see that their current annual income is 0. Okay? But if we keep looking, we'll see that they're responsible for paying $100 in rent. There's also a $105 utility allowance. So basically, this resident would have to come up with, we know, at least $100 to pay the rent, plus somehow be able to meet their utility allowance. So the question here is, how does that happen? Okay? And we, or I at least as a funder, assume that if the resident's still living there, they're paying $100 in rent. So then the question becomes, what income do they have that may not be disclosed? Now, this household may have exempt income, and that's fine. And what you would want to do is make sure that there's a comment entered on their resident record, and that comment could say something like, this household has a student loan that's not showing here, or this household is drawing off their assets, okay, or some other sort of explanation as to how the household is meeting their expenses. The other thing that could be going on here, and I apologize for zipping back and forth on you. Okay, we're seeing $100 in resident rent. Let's go look for a subsidy. This shows that this household is PBRA. That means they've got project-based rental assistance. But there's no dollar amount. So that can clue me in on a couple of things that could be going on. First off, whenever there's a subsidy type, there needs to be a dollar amount, and vice versa. We used to have a validation that wouldn't let you save the record if you had one without the other, but that was causing some import issues, and so we removed that validation. But you need to make sure that when you have a subsidy type, you have an amount filled in. So it could be that there was a misunderstanding, or it wasn't, the resident's rent wasn't filled in correctly because maybe you didn't know what the split was at the time that you entered their record. So you definitely would want to go in and make sure that that was correct. So maybe it's a really large project-based rental assistance, and maybe it turns out that the resident's portion of the rent is actually 0 as well. You would want to go in and make that correction so that that all flowed together. And that's it for Unit 112. And I'm going to go to the next page on our corrections list. We're going to look at Unit 113. And again, I'm going to scroll my page up so it's a little easier to follow. And with Unit 113, this one was also covered in the home mini session. And so I'm going to say when we look at it here, again, we see a household that's over income and over by 140. The rent is also over the allowed rent that can be paid. And at that point, we would know that there's a potential issue. We could scroll over and see if there was a subsidy on the unit. And on this one, there is a subsidy. And so technically, for the Housing Finance Commission, a resident can pay over the tax credit maximum if they have a voucher. But we're going to look closer at that farther down on Unit 118 because there are some other concerns, especially with other funders, for when that happens. So Cheryl used this one more as an example of specifically what this means for home when somebody is over income and over rent like this. For tax credits, the other thing we would notice is they're over by 140, but it certainly is not their first recert. So that wouldn't be a concern with being over the 140 at this point.
This is Cheryl again. I have one thing to add from the home session earlier. This was the example of a household in a home-funded unit with income that exceeded 80% of median income. And we talked about how that needed to be remedied, and it depends on if unit is fixed or floating. But to go for one more step for reporting purposes, anytime you have a household in a home unit with income that exceeds 80, please include a comment on the household record to tell us what you're doing to resolve the issue. It could be tenants received a rent increase. Rent increase isn't going into effect until such and such date next year. But let us know that you have that you're aware that they're now over income and what you've done to resolve the issue in the comments section.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back over, maybe. There we go. And next up, we've got units 114 and 115, and I didn't see any issues on those units. But then we get to units 116 and 117, showing as vacant and empty. Basically, both of these are saying that nobody has lived in this unit for all of the reporting year. They've been vacant. The differential between the vacant and the empty. In tax credit terms, a vacant unit is a unit that nobody lives in, but it was previously qualified as a tax credit unit, therefore it's generating credits. For your other funders, the credit piece doesn't come into play, but it does tell them that it is a unit, that it's restricted, and it has been rented to a low-income household. Empty, on the other hand, means it's a unit that has never had a qualified resident in it. Okay? It's never met the restrictions. It's not generating tax credits if you're a tax credit property. Okay? So nobody living in either of these, but there is a technical difference between what vacant and empty means. None of your funders want to see a unit that says either one of these things on an annual report, because we don't want to see a unit that's been sitting there all year with nobody living in it. So if you have one of these, you want to say, well, wait a minute, did anybody live there? And make sure you get the resident's information in. Sometimes when we see the vacant or empty, this is your common area or your staff unit, and you simply failed to, go in and say that the resident manager lives there and it's your common area. Please do that. If you leave it sitting as vacant or empty, on your table 4, when it looks at your occupancy rates and it looks at your turnover time, it is going to throw those numbers way out of whack. And you're going to show, wait a minute, especially on a smaller property like this, how come my occupancy is so low? And how come it says my average turnover time was over 100 days? Well, if you have units here that show they were, vacant for 365 days of the year, that is definitely going to affect those numbers. And keep in mind, those of you with tax credits, if it says empty, it's not generating credits. Usually when we see empty is in an upload that hasn't had anybody live there all year, because remember, the upload basically starts from that table, that year's table. It starts over from scratch. So if nobody's been in there, WBARS is not going to know that in a prior year there was a qualified resident there. So definitely do not want to see these unless you're in a lease up and you specifically know that you didn't get all of your units leased up. So moving to Unit 118. On this one, you'll notice there's an income in bold here, and it's in bold, of course, because it's over the applicable limit. And the utility, or the total rent with utility allowance exceeds the limit. The limit is $704. The resident's paying $694 plus a $105 utility allowance for a total of $799. So similar to what happened up here in 113, but this one we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what this means. So they're paying over the maximum rent. For tax credits, we're going to look over and see, does this household have subsidy? And if they have subsidy, it is acceptable that they pay more than the maximum tax credit rent, because that subsidy source is going to determine what their rent portion is. However, other funders may not be okay with this. In particular, the City of Seattle will not allow for this. And Cheryl, you want to say more about this?
Sure. The vast majority of the city's contracts do restrict the tenant's portion of the rent to no more than the maximum allowed rent. We do have a handful of contracts that permit otherwise, but you need to read your contract closely. So overall, we do not follow the Finance Commission's if there's $1 of subsidy, it's okay rule. So please check your contract and make sure that you're capping rent in accordance. And how that would work is, if, for example, you receive the letter from the subsidy provider and it says that the tenant's portion should be an amount that is over the maximum allowed rent, you would need to issue a letter to the tenant alerting them that actually their rent will be this lower amount because you have another more restrictive funder in the property. However, the city does have a couple over-income clauses in our contracts. The most typical one in most of ours is our over-income clause for when households exceed 65% of area median income. The typical language says that the owner may or shall, with 1 year notice, you could increase the rent of a person whose income is over 65% AMI to 1/3 or 1/12 of either 30 or 35% of their actual income. Most of our contracts say may, because we've been noticing some increased patterns with higher income households in restricted units and rents being perhaps lower than even the maximum allowed rent for those units. We have been taking the stance of asking owners to, yes, it's May, but we are asking you to please do take advantage of those rent increase options, acknowledging that if you have other more restrictive funders like the Finance Commission, you won't be able to exceed their limits. In addition to that, our newer contracts have a mandatory rent increase clause that states that in the event the household's income exceeds 140% of the original restricted percentage of the unit. So the easy way to know that is if the validation annual income exceeds tax credit HUD by 140% comes up. In those cases, the mandatory rent increase language says that you must increase the rent up to the maximum allowed rent. So please look at your city contracts carefully for both optional and mandatory rent increase clauses.
Thanks, Cheryl. And please keep in mind, even if it's allowed that you charge over the maximum while the resident is on subsidy, if this resident is on a voucher and they lose their Section 8 voucher, that means you immediately would have to drop their rent. And if it's project-based, if they go off subsidy for some reason, you'd know that right away because you were administering the project-based subsidy, you would have to drop this rent for the resident to within the limit once they lose that subsidy. So it is an extra layer. If you're doing this and it's allowed, you really have to watch that subsidy, and if it goes away, make sure you drop the rent immediately. So that is for Unit 118, and the last one we're going to look at is Unit 119. Cheryl covered this one in the home mini session as well, and if you don't have home, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this entry. It's a resident that moved out, and there's just some, if you do have home, you need to change some of the home terms, and I'm going to rely on you looking back at what Cheryl said in the home mini session for that. As we're talking about home, there is, a note here. So you go through, you make your fixes, and then you regenerate your Table 1. You look at your annual summary report and see where you're at. You may find out that you made some of the fixes, but, maybe we adjusted some AMIs here, like that 30. I said you had to bump to 40 or 50. And now you may be short on 30%, and you may need to go back in and look for a household that qualified at 30 that you may have not have designated that way. So it's a game of do the Excel export, find the errors, fix them on the resident records, regenerate, and see where you're at. And as you went through this process with this one of the things that definitely did not get fixed is when we looked at the annual summary report, there were home units and they were all designated for one of the funders and none for the other, and they weren't meeting requirements. So that is something that we definitely would know you would have to go in and do some work on the home side to do some redesignations. But once you have gone through and you've done a couple iterations and your Excel export looks good, your annual summary report looks good, and you've met all of the requirements, you don't quite want to, and I'm just going to go out of this, you don't quite want to submit your Table 1 yet. Because once you have your Table 1 ready to go, you really want to make sure you go in and you look at your Tables 2 and 3 before you start hitting the submit button. And oh look, Cheryl, I've timed out. Let me get you back in here. Because we're going to take a look now at Tables 2 and 3.
And real quick, Linda Kay, could you just show folks how to get back into that report one more time, the Excel?
Yes, definitely, because we have to head that way anyways.
Perfect.
So I'm going back into reports. Remember, don't use the quick edit Table 1 because that gets you to the standalone Table 1. You won't have a submit button. Tables 2 and 3 won't be there. I get calls about that. Hey, the other tables aren't there. And that's why. So I'm going in the long way, as we call it, to access the full annual report by year. Oops. Going to Table 1, and to get that Excel export, remember I wanted to make sure I had unit information year to date, and then I come over here and hit this Excel export button, and that's what puts it to Excel. Depending on the security level that IT has set on your system, you may get a couple of things that say, kind of like, do you really want to open this? Do you trust the source? I think you can trust us, so you can go ahead and open it. But some people have told me even after that they still can't open it, that they have to have their IT go in and, I don't know, make them able to open it. So if you have an issue with opening it, you've gone through the little warnings and it still won't open, I suggest you check in with your IT department because I have heard that sometimes that's an issue. So I'm going to click to Table 2 and step out of the way and let Cheryl take over.
Thanks for bearing with us. We're down to our last half an hour. We did cover table 2 and 3 in the morning session. So there's not a whole lot more digging deeper that can be done on these tables because they're pretty straightforward. So I'm just going to go run through really quick. We're going to ignore all these validations to start. The first section is the number of restricted renter or owner units. The vast majority of you will be reporting renter units unless you have a rare situation where you have, for example, a manufactured mobile home park that is affordable and owners actually live in those units. The system gives you a great hint right here where it says total number of restricted units as of 12/31 was, so let's see if we can just plug that in. Please keep in mind that you should not start table 2 or 3 until you're completely done with table 1 for the year, and table 1 includes all of your households that have resided during the year. So I'm going to wait and save all of this at the end so we can try to get rid of all the validation issues at once. But if you were operating in the real WebARS system, save frequently so as to not lose your information. The most common errors with this here is that either it doesn't match because the unit designations you've reported on table 1 are inaccurate. For example, you've reported common area or market units, and now you're trying to count them as restricted units on table 2. So that's the first thing to check if things aren't lining up. The second is if you don't count vacant restricted units at the end of the year, then the result will be lower than the system calculation. Section 2 is auto-populated, so you don't need to do anything. It pulls from table 1, and likewise with section 3. Individual households is a single person, and families are households of 2 or more people. Race and ethnicity. So you're reporting race and ethnicity for the head of household, and the best practice is to, after move-in, have the household fill out a race and ethnicity special needs form. Households are totally welcome to not disclose, but we do want owners to make the attempt to at least gather the information. At least for city contracts, it is required to report on the race and ethnicity of your households every year. So the race category is pretty straightforward, so let's just plug in some numbers and see what happens. Let's do 2, 3. And Hispanic or Latino is a subset of race. So it shouldn't be that this column equals 23 and this column equals 23. This one's always going to be a subset. You may have households who disclose that they are, for example, white or Caucasian, but also Hispanic, and in that case you would report them as white and then also as Hispanic. Or you may have cases where the household doesn't disclose a race, but does disclose Hispanic ethnicity. And so in that case, you would just report them in the Hispanic ethnicity column. So it looks like I'm still a few shy. So let's see if we can bring it up to where it needs to be. See, I got, oh, there we go. Now we're at green. So other multiracial, you can include comments if you happen to know details, but again, not required. We might ask some questions if we get a report that says all households not disclosed. That may make us wonder if maybe you didn't attempt to gather the information. Also, if you are operating a property and you know, it seems to be represented almost exclusively of one race or category, you might want to think about your affirmative marketing plan and if there are things you need to do to maybe outreach those who may be less likely to apply. The restricted unit household income pulls directly from Table 1 records from the actual percent AMI, so nothing to do there. Single mothers and single fathers with children, if you are serving those types of households in your properties, please let us know. And this last section, section 7, again, the system gives you a great hint right here, total households served. Almost always you're going to be reporting renter households, again, unless you have a very rare owner affordable unit situation. So let's save and see if we got rid of some validations. All right, so we got green, 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 save successfully. So we are good to go. Any questions about Table 2? All right. Table 3 is special needs and homeless. So if you have a contract requirement from one or more funders to serve a particular special needs population, it appears this property has a requirement for developmentally disabled. You must, on Table 3, report how many households in that special needs category that you served to meet your contract requirements. However, we really appreciate and are strongly urging all of you to please tell us, to the greatest extent that you can, any special needs that you're serving in your properties, regardless of whether you have a contract requirement. At the city, and I'm sure many other of our funding partners, we receive questions from our elected officials and from policymakers. You know, how many veterans were served in the City of Seattle affordable housing portfolio last year? Or how many, you know, persons who are domestic violence survivors? And it's difficult to, you know, provide any real concrete data because we're only getting the information that's what you give us. So if you're serving special needs, if you're serving persons with HIV/AIDS, and we see on Table 1 that you've got some HOPWA subsidies, some housing opportunities for persons with AIDS subsidies, but then we get to Table 3 and there's no persons living with HIV/AIDS reported at your property, then we'll ask, oh, I see some HOPWA subsidies on Table 1. Why don't you tell us how many households in that special needs category you served? Really wonderful information, so please let us know. Again, just only report one special needs per household. There is a multiple special needs option, and you can include comments to say, for example, if a person is perhaps both a domestic violence survivor and a veteran. Homeless households and restricted units, again, you must complete this section if you have a contract requirement to serve homeless households. Individuals, so that would be your household of one person. Families, 2 or more. This would also be where you would report if you had contract requirements to serve families with children under the age of 18. Any questions about Table 3? All right, we're going to move on to the supplemental matrix of annual reporting materials, and I'm going to see if I can pull it up. All right. So once you've completed Table 1, 2, 3, and you submitted all of those, most of those are due for all your other funders at the end of January. And then by end of June, you have Table 4, 4A, 4B to submit. You're not done yet. There is still a list of supplemental annual reporting materials that you need to submit that you'll have to send us via email. That doesn't happen through WBARS. Unsubmitted annual reporting supplemental materials is probably what, at least at the city, we spend the most time on during our annual report review process, is tracking down all of this sort of documentation. So you can save yourself and us a bunch of time if you can review the matrix and send us everything per instructions with your annual report by the end of June. So you'll just want to look across and see which funders you have, and then in the matrix down you'll see what funders want what. So City of Seattle, we want the whole kit and caboodle, but the Finance Commission, they have a separate process, and Lana Kay, would you like to chime in on that?
Historically, we have sent each owner a report request for each of their properties. We started a new internal database last year, and so last year our process ran a little bit differently, where we directed you to go look on our website and from there download the forms that you needed. And to be perfectly honest, we're not sure which way it's going to go this year because we're still trying to get our software to generate all the correct letters with all the correct unit picks. where we typically ask for a sampling of certifications. So for the Housing Finance Commission, you may get a letter or you may get an email directing you to look at our website.
All right, so I'm just going to go down the list of required documents here. The first, financial statement or audit per contract conditions. So read your contracts. Most of the city contracts require audited financial statements for the property and for the borrower. However, if it's a property that doesn't have tax credits or isn't like an LLC that has an individual audit, then just send us your agency audit. But we do want to see your audits for your property and borrow. Whatever you've got, send them our way. Current copy of insurance certificates. So again, it depends on your funder contract. The city sent out a clarifying email earlier this year about our deed of trust insurance requirements. We require both a certificate of liability insurance as well as evidence of property insurance. And the City of Seattle needs to be listed as, the certificate holder, additional insured. It usually shows up in the lower left-hand box of the certificate. We often get the insurance certificates for, other lenders or property management companies, but we want the insurance certificates that show us. So please send us those. You'll note up here that you can send all this stuff via email or mail. The city also has, obviously, our street address, but please just use the P.O. box listed here. It seems there has been some goose if both the street address and the P.O. box address are used, so please use the address listed on the matrix here. Moving down to a copy of reserve account bank statements. So this would be for your required replacement, reserve, operating reserve. Some of you may have a sinking security fund or a social service reserve. So send us your bank statements as of 12/31 each year. And the balances on those bank statements, and we'll cover this in the spring table for 4A, 4B training, but the balance needs to 100% match the reported balance on table 4A. So if it doesn't, you need to let us know why. Marketing materials or statement explaining approach to affirmative marketing. So if you've updated your HUD affirmative marketing plan, send us a copy. If you did some marketing for compliance with tax credits by, say, advertising on Craigslist and a letter to a housing authority and notices to some social service agencies, send in what you did. It also, and just make sure that it says submit only if changes, but if you read your city contracts, and I can just speak to the city, we actually do want to see the materials that you marketed. So send it in our way and we'll include it. If you've had any fair housing complaints or dispositions, please send us copies of those records. Likewise, neighborhood complaints and outcomes. And for this, it looks like the city's the only one requiring this. Part of the city's administrative and finance plan to administer the housing levy includes direction for our office to monitor this. So if you have a significant issue with a neighbor, not just like a single noise complaint, but something that's been really problematic, maybe there was community meetings, maybe there was some mediation, we definitely want to know if there's some challenges in the neighborhood around your property. Management plan, if there's been any changes, let us know. The city requires that you operate your property in accordance with the management plan that was submitted and approved by the city. So if you've made changes, you need to send those our way. Capital needs assessment. If you're not familiar what capital needs assessment is, there's a sample on the City of Seattle Office of Housing website. It's typically a long view, a 20-year picture of the anticipated building component replacements and expenses that may be needed over the long term. All the new city contracts require a completed capital needs assessment 6 months after construction completion. And so if you're updating your CNA or if you've obtained a new CNA, please send that our way. And on the capital needs assessment, and we'll be providing additional information in the coming months, but you may see that Table 5 has shown up in WebARS, but it's currently blank and there's nothing there. We're working behind the scenes on a shorter, we hope pretty simple version of a 5-year CNA snapshot that will tie with the replacement reserve balances reported on Table 4. That Table 5 is still in testing stage right now, and we may be reaching out to some of your organizations to assist us with that testing. We want to make sure that it is functional and user-friendly before we roll it out for everybody. And when it does get rolled out, there'll be additional trainings offered, technical assistance. It'll most likely be optional for the first year, and then different funders may require it after that, but it may not be a universal requirement for all funders. So stay tuned on that, but don't panic. We're really not trying to make it onerous or really difficult. We just want it to be a fairly simple snapshot of what your upcoming capital needs are for your property. The last is a summary of any tenant service changes. So if you maybe you hired a chemical dependency specialist and you're offering a new recovery program, tell us. We like to know what's going on at your properties, and just let us know. So all of these materials, send them to us. If you just send them to me, they're not going to get to State Commerce. So you need to put together all the documents that are requested and then send them all at once. It is helpful if you send them one email per property, and to rather than, for example, sending us an email with one PDF with 4 properties included, that can be a little tedious for us to sort through. So much less likelihood for human error if you can just send us one email with all your supplemental materials per property. Is there any questions about matrix of supplemental and reporting materials? Like I said, this is the stuff we probably spend most of our time on. It's, sending us the wrong insurance certificate, sending us expired insurance certificates, sending us reserve bank account statements for not December 31st. And we really do want affirmation, not just here's our insurance and here's our bank statement, and then you don't say whether or not any of the other applied. It's really helpful, and I give credit to organizations that send us an email that just includes a quick bullet point list that confirms fair housing, not applicable, so you had no fair housing complaints. We really want that affirmation rather than just not sending us anything. We're going to want to know one way or the other. All right.
So while we're waiting for questions on that, Cheryl, do you want to switch back over to the presentation? And we have some technical assistance slides that you might find of interest. And then Cheryl, I think the training for tables 4, 4A, 4B, and 5, that'll be you.
Yes, most likely will be me. It'll probably be, I think in prior years it was in February, but because we're still in testing stage on Table 5, not sure if that will be included in this training quite yet, but we'll get a date confirmed in the next few weeks, and we'll be sending out information about that.
And that typically, I think that's just been in webinar format, not in a face-to-face, so watch for that in a webinar.
Yep.
One request I have is, can you show the submission status overview in the custom reports?
Sure. I'm not sure about the custom reports.
So custom reports is an area that is built into WBARS. It's still kind of under development and mostly for funders to use. But there are some management companies that have asked for access to additional reports that they could pull from the system. And so if you want that, you specifically have to be given that access. And I think Nona at the Department of Commerce has kind of spearheaded giving that access. To get to it, actually, it is back on the landing page. It's back on the projects page for the custom reports. So not very many people have access to it, so I don't really think that, I mean, we can show you where it is, but I don't really think that's something that we are probably going to cover in this webinar. So if you have questions on the custom reporting, I would say the best option there is to contact the funder who gave you that access to those custom reportings. Because, for example, at the commission, I've never really looked in there at those custom reports, but I know Department of Commerce is using them. I don't know if the City of Seattle is using them.
No, I don't think we're using them. I mean, at the funder level, we can run our own reports to kind of play around with things. So, you know, if we always accept feedback, if there are certain types of customizable reports that you would be interested in, please let us know. There is a fairly long process with making any changes to the WebARS system, and we have a number of things already in queue, but we're always open to suggestions.
So, guys, real quick, it sounds like everyone has access to this feature now.
Oh,
so,
great.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
See,
I think it's really recent. So.
Okay. See, I said at the commission we don't look. I didn't even know we had access. How about that?
It's really recent.
So I'm working now to pull up the annual report submission. And I'm trying to remember where it is.
The status?
Yep.
On the report summary page.
Okay.
Guys, this is Nona. I'm so sorry for throwing you for a loop there at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Can
so
you hear
this
me?
one's fairly blank. Typically, you would see here table
Guess not.
1, 2, 3,
Thanks.
4. You would see when it was submitted, who it was submitted by. You could also see if it was, you know, maybe submitted from on-site to property manager to owner, and then the owner unsubmitted it back to property manager. So if you are ever wondering where a table was at or if it has been submitted all the way to funder, it's the report activity history on the annual report cover page tab.
While we're waiting for more questions, Cheryl, you just want to click back to that technical assistance. I don't know if we got that slide. Oh, you have it up.
There we go. So here's your contacts. So you can call or email me if you have questions, City of Seattle. For King County, some of you may have recalled Eileen Bleeker, who recently retired. You can now call Wendy DeRubio with your questions. At State Commerce, Tyree is your contact, so feel free to contact any of us. And for the Finance Commission, you want to contact your assigned portfolio analyst, which is the staff person that's listed for your property in WebARS. All right, well, we hope that this training has been helpful. As always, we appreciate feedback. And Lanike, Justin, are we planning to send out an email for feedback? That's something we'll chat about, and maybe you'll receive something. But if we don't send out anything formal, feel free to email any of us and let us know if there are topics you'd like us to cover in a little more detail, if we went too fast, if we went too slow. We're always trying to improve these trainings and make it worth your time. So thank you so much, and we'll leave it at that. Have a good afternoon.